So, if I can have the slides up, I want to start, I guess, in a similar place as where Michael brought us. And there's a lot of suspense about it, but you'll see it in a second. All right, do you know who this guy is? Jaron Lanier. He's one of the pioneers of virtual communities, Silicon Valley guy, advisor to Microsoft, and he's also one of the guys who's written a lot about tech business models and what's wrong with tech business models nowadays. And this is a quote from him, is what he says: the higher up an executive is at Google and Facebook, the more aggressive they are at limiting screen time for their kids, right? So these guys know what's going on, and they're busy, protecting their family, caring for them, doing what they can to have their education right. And at the very same time, they're kind of creating a little monster here. And that's not only at Silicon Valley. I think there are many places where I feel that kind of split between our private and our professional lives, right? We're kind of silently busy creating a world that we don't really want. Why? Because we feel stuck in systems that, we feel entrenched in the systems where there are 1,000 reasons why we can't really do things differently. And whereas you come at it from the point of view of societal good or the point of view of corporate innovation that is trying to unlock growth, like many of you are, my feeling is that the frame of business has become too small for our time, too small for the kind of problems that we see in the world, too small for the kind of aspirations and innovations we want to bring into the world. And I think this notion of ecosystem is becoming a new possibility, a structure for a new possibility to do something different. So that's what I want to talk to you about today. At the same time as this kind of discovery came to me, you have the business world, and McKinsey just released a book that is telling us that there's a lot going in that direction as well. They call it, this ecosystem stuff, the single largest economic transformation in the history of the planet. And they say that 1/3 of global GDP will come from ecosystems. So the world is shifting. This whole categorization in industries is disappearing, and there's kind of a new thing coming up, right? And up to us to see what we're going to do with it. But I'll tell you my own inspiration. I was working for quite some time at the World Economic Forum, and at the World Economic Forum in Davos, we're supposed to talk about these kind of things, right? Systemic stuff, industry stuff, global stuff, etc. And there's lots of interesting and inspiring people. But after a while, I got a little bit tired of it because there was a lot of really interesting conversations, but at the same time, it was happening in really nice rooms. We would eat very well, would drink very well. People would sleep in 5-star hotels. If you looked outside the room, it looked like this. Nothing was really wrong with the world, from a Davos perspective. So it felt a little bit disconnected. So I left and I went to China, and I found myself in another workshop room, but and having the same kind of discussions. But if we looked outside, this is 10 years ago, all you could see is this. We were at the top of a 5-star hotel in a Beijing CBD. And if you look down, you could not see the bottom of the street because of peak pollution levels. So I thought, okay, that conversation now is clicking for me. Something's going to happen in China that will invent a new system and a new way of doing things. And it wasn't just about pollution. It was about health. It was about unemployment. It was about all of these social and societal and environmental and economic development issues that we deal with everywhere. So while I was there, I thought, well, because of this kind of atmosphere, I think something's happening here already that is reinventing the way we're going to look at stuff in the future. We used to look at China as the factory of the world. Well, it was kind of obvious that something else was brewing. And so as I was there, I started to ask people around, what are some things that you see that, new models, innovations, etc., that you feel are changing your lives? And a lot of people turned me to this guy. This is 10 years ago. I didn't really know. I'd heard about Jack Ma, didn't really know about Alibaba and Taobao and all of these businesses, all of these new things. And also the thing is that the way people were talking about Jack Ma was really almost with an emotion in their eyes, right? They were really touched by the kind of things that this guy and his team had brought to their lives, because all of a sudden they had access to all sorts of things that they didn't have access before. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to look into that because that's interesting to me. And so I discovered this thing called Taobao. Just out of curiosity, how many people know Taobao? Yeah, still maybe half of the people here. So Taobao is the biggest part of Alibaba. We all know Alibaba. Taobao is the biggest part of Alibaba. It's mostly only in China. And it started as an eBay, right? It's an e-commerce platform, as you can kind of see on the screen. And so I said, okay, let me look at it. I'm curious. I'm in this world of innovation. Let me look at what's happening here. And so I was new with the business model framework, as you've discovered during today. And so I thought, okay, let me look at the business model evolution of Taobao. And in 10 years, I realized, well, it was a really impressive thing that started from nothing and kept going from evolution to evolution. So it started as an eBay type of thing, consumer to consumer platform, then went to become a small business to consumer platform, like more of a professional platform, because all of these people that had something to sell on eBay, all of a sudden they said, oh, I can make a living here on this platform. So they left their jobs and they started to open online shops, and Taobao supported that, and you had like an avalanche of micro-entrepreneurs coming onto the platform. And so they adapted their whole business to serve them. And then they added another layer in 2008 called Tmall. Maybe some of you have heard of this word, Tmall. Tmall is the fancy version of online shopping that's for the big brands, international and Chinese, that were trying to establish themselves in the country. And then it went on and on and on, right? So I thought, okay, that's really interesting from a business model standpoint. The guys are very smart, obviously, all of this, adaptation along the way, etc. But something else was going on. I couldn't explain everything out of, this business box here. Because, for example, in 2003, you have to put yourself back in the shoes of someone in China in 2003. The economy was not what it is today, right? This is 20 years ago, so there was a lot of bribes, a lot of corruption, a lot of fake goods, not a lot of trust in the economy, right? So Taobao and the team, they saw this, and they said, okay, it's not there, we're going to build it ourselves. So they started to build trust in the economy. Two-way review systems, this review system that we are now used to. In China at the time, when you don't have trust in the physical economy, all of a sudden that gives you a platform where you feel for the first time maybe you can trust a seller or buyer, right? So it created a lot of trust. The other thing that was missing is all of the infrastructure, digital payments, express logistics industry was all missing. So they said, all right, we're going to build it ourselves. They took a responsibility that went way beyond the business itself, right? They built a university for micro-entrepreneurs, knowing that these guys, they had a lot of ambitions, but they didn't know how to do business. So they built a university to help them. They integrated all sorts of value of third-party service providers in new value chains. They created a whole new world. And by 2008, Jack Ma was saying, we're not like a typical company. It's more like we're managing a country. We set prices, we build infrastructure, we manage demonstrations, we create trust. It's more like managing a country, right? It's not really like managing a business. So I thought, okay, that's interesting. There's something here that I haven't seen before, really. And then I thought, okay, let me decode that, in the world of our tools, etc. So I thought, okay, there is a first lens here, the lens of the value proposition. You need to get that right? It's product market fit. We've all heard that. It's the holy grail in Silicon Valley. So you need to understand your customers. You need to create something that's good for them. And that's really great. So GoPro, for example, is an example of a great product meeting a new customer segment. They have the foundation of a great business. That's fantastic. But of course, as we know, there is something a little more complex around the value proposition that includes the value proposition and the customer. It's the business model and the typical story that you might have heard around innovative business model is Nespresso. Nespresso had a product. They identified a customer. They tried to launch the product using the business model template of the mother company, Nestle, B2B company. They realized, no, that's not how we're going to do it. They failed. And then they realized, okay, we have to build a consumer-facing business with all of these different things that I'm not going to get into that create a stronger formula of value creation, right? That then became a success on the market. So that's the second lens. And of course, there's this third lens, and the third lens is the lens of the ecosystem. So now normally, we look at the business, and you've seen this in a few presentations today. We look at a business and we say, is this business fit for the kind of environment that we're in right now? So you ask yourself questions around industry forces, what are competitors doing, key trends, socio-economic trends, what are the climates, the economic climate, is it favorable or not, market forces, and so on and so forth. But ecosystem pioneers, they think differently. They don't think of, is my idea ready for this kind of environment? They say, how can I shape this environment so that my idea will be ready, right? And so Tesla is another example of an ecosystem, different kind. You have different types of ecosystem. Alibaba is more of a transaction ecosystem. This is more what we call a solution ecosystem. But the principle is the same. They go beyond the business box and they start doing things that are unusual for a business, partnering with competitors, building the infrastructure, right? Charging stations, developing deep tech that you would only expect the government normally to do. Pioneering regulation, helping other users adopt it, and so on and so forth, right? They take a responsibility, in other words, that's a lot larger than what a business would normally do. And so you can think about it, if the Jack Ma's and Elon Musk and others of this world would go to business school to, try and pass a business school exam, typically the professor would say, okay, let's look at your idea and let's ask a few questions. Is there a market? Is the technology available? Infrastructure, do people want it? And so on and so forth. And these guys would basically answer no to every one of these questions, right? But they'll say, no, there's no market, we'll create it. We'll create the technology, we'll build the infrastructure, do people want it? No, they don't know they want it because they don't have a sense of what we're building. So we'll inspire them. Can they pay for it? No, but we'll find a way that they can pay for it through other ways, right? Engaging maybe another stakeholder in the system. Is it the right timing? No, but we'll create our own momentum, right? If Jack Ma had said, is this the right timing? No, it was not the right timing to do e-commerce in China. They created their own momentum. So they would fail business school because they're not playing the business school game. They're playing a bigger game. They're playing the ecosystem game, right? And so if you look, then I thought, okay, Taobao is a great example. And I actually went and looked at some of the most, for me, interesting societal transformations, societal and economic transformations in the last 100 years. And there's a lot of these principles that have been active in all of these transformations that you see on the screen. This idea of going beyond business, a person or a group of people that go beyond business and take a larger responsibility to make something happen that benefits, society and of course creates a lot of value in the economy as well. So all of these ecosystem pioneers have something in common. They don't just look at their house the way a CEO would do, they look at the entire village, right? And they take responsibility for the entire village. They build schools, they build pipelines, they build, not pipelines would be another word, but they build the pipes, they build the communications infrastructure, they ensure harmony in the village, and so on and so forth. So they don't think like a CEO, they think more like a mayor, right? A mayor has to take responsibility for the entire village. And so I want to share with you a little bit what these ecosystem leaders are doing differently and how we can kind of embrace that ourselves in our own industries and sectors. The first thing that they do differently is that they don't have a business mission. They have a societal purpose. Because to do something so big and to engage others in the process of doing something so big, you're never going to inspire or convince anyone that they're going to get any value out of following your own selfish business mission, right? It's too small. They have a societal purpose. So I'll give you a couple examples. We've seen with Tesla. Tesla doesn't really build sports cars. They do that. But from 2006, on their website, there is a blog post that you can actually find from Elon Musk that outlines his vision, and he says the real vision is to move the whole economy towards a solar electric economy, right? And 15 years later, you can actually see it. Nowadays, it's these things that you see, solar panels, battery walls, on top of all the car models, etc. Taobao, it's not really about e-commerce. So I've gone back into interviewing some of the executives that were with Jack Ma at the beginning, and they said their number one operational metric was not how many goods are we going to sell, how many subscriptions are we selling, etc. It was how many jobs can we create. That was the sole focus of that startup. Why? Because it was what the ecosystem really wanted. And it was very much aligned in that ecosystem. The Chinese government was busy lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, so they aligned themselves with that bigger agenda, right? So job creation and entrepreneurship was really how they measured their success. More traditional company, Roche, who have been working with in the last 5 years, they're busy doing this transition from being a drug manufacturer, where they spend their time in the R&D room, doing really good R&D and then marketing it and pushing it out to the world. They realize now that's not the model for the future. Because there is all of this patient data, there is all of these new next generation diagnostic, they realize there's all these assets, but in order for them to create value with that, they cannot do it alone. So what are they doing? So they have this vision of personalized healthcare, and they have to work with the ecosystem in order to shift the entire healthcare ecosystem to make their own innovation possible. And so they have societal purposes that are not just advertisement statement, right? They deliver on them. What you see in the world from these companies is actually these things. It's not just a cover for selling more products and services, although it's part of it, obviously. Now, you've seen tools today. You've seen the value proposition canvas a little bit. You'll see it more tomorrow, but the value proposition canvas really is an ensemble of features, woven into a story of value creation. The value proposition canvas itself is included in the business model. The business model is the largest story of how you create value for your organization, how you capture some of that value for your organization. And so we can ask ourselves, what does an ecosystem look like? How can we play with the structure so we have a sense of the components to play with in order to create an ecosystem? So I want to take 1 minute or invite you to take 1 minute at your table to identify, so you've seen the 9 building blocks of the business model canvas. So at your table with your neighbor, just spend 1 minute trying to identify what are key components of the ecosystem, the level above. What would you say they are? Let's spend 1 minute. Okay, can I hear a few things? Just shout a couple of words. What are some of these components? Alignment. Relationships. Stable. Infrastructure. Emotion, okay. Trust, okay. So a variety of things. So here is how we've looked at it. My clicker wants to work. So if you kind of keep this metaphor of the city, right? Mayor kind of looking after a city or a village. There's essentially 3 things I want you to keep in mind as far as the components to play with to build an ecosystem. So the first one is economic actors. Economic actor is not only you as an organization, but all of the other actors, could be people and organization, public and private, everyone who needs to gain value out of the system, right? And the key principle here is that you want to feel free to bring the right type of stakeholders, the right type of actors into a new constellation that typically is not going to look like the traditional industry, right? That's why in all of these ecosystem examples, you see unusual players that typically don't belong to the industry, right? So connect all the new actors in new value networks. That's the number one. Now, just to give you examples of this, so Tesla, right? So Tesla integrated battery makers. They partnered with competitors, Toyota and Mercedes, to grow the entire pie of the electric industry when they started. Taobao, worked with 70 banks to build a digital payment platform, which became Alipay, express service providers, etc. They brought a lot of different actors together to do this. Roche is, as I said a little bit earlier, they're starting to see that if they want their idea to work, they need hospitals to work differently, they need to have digital solutions, so they involve startups, insurances, payers need to reimburse different types of things, governments need to fund different things. So they realize they cannot do it alone, they have to work as the, in co-creation mode with their ecosystem. So they weave different types of relationship with these actors, old and new, in order to be aligned towards delivering their purpose, their societal purpose. That's number one. The second thing, we've heard it, it's the infrastructure. Typically, you do not have an infrastructure that supports users and producers to do what they need to do in the ecosystem. So you need to build it. The infrastructure could be physical, Tesla charging stations. It could be digital, lots of digital marketplaces nowadays. It can also be organizational. So I'll give you an example a little bit later. The key thing here is that there's going to be pieces that exist already of that infrastructure. But if you want to weave a new ensemble that does something different, you're going to have to plug holes, you're going to have to build bridges, you're going to have to bring a new sort of performance in that infrastructure so that it supports what the ecosystem wants to do. So I'll give you an example of one of those examples of the last 100 years, the way the PC industry really started to develop. At the very beginning of the PC industry was IBM, where you had one computer and one manufacturer that did everything, from the hardware to the software to the components, etc. So that was good in terms of control, but it didn't really, inject a lot of energy into the system, just one player, not a lot of competition, etc. Then kind of got broken apart, and you had an open market with all of these different manufacturer, component makers, and so on and so forth, who were all doing something different. And that's great because specialization, but it's not so great for really weaving the whole, bringing the whole PC industry somewhere. So there was a lack of innovation. And so one of those actors was actually very good at what they were doing. They were building microprocessors, and maybe you heard the Moore's Law, right? So they could build increasingly more powerful microprocessors, and their business model looked like that, very high level. They had increasingly more powerful processors to sell to the PC manufacturers, but the PC manufacturers didn't really have a need for them, right? Because they were doing what they were doing, and they didn't really have any other need for power. It wasn't the kind of industry that we have today. And so they realized, well, one executive said, if we do an innovation in the processor and Microsoft or independent software parties don't do a corresponding innovation, our innovation will be worthless, right? So they realized that in order to grow themselves or in order to do something different, they could not stay, doing what they were doing on their own. So what they did is they said, okay, we cannot just look at our own business model. We have to go out to the ecosystem. We have to take a larger responsibility, right? And for them, the ecosystem and the infrastructure that they had to build is really the motherboard of the PC, right? Motherboard of the PC with all of these different manufacturers and component makers with their own business model. And what they did, not a technical person myself, but very simple to understand. There's all of these different components that talk to each other, but Intel developed what they call PCI buses, which connects all of these different components, so the modem card, the sound card, the network equipment, etc., to bring more power and more efficiency and more flow into the motherboard, so that it would accelerate data transfer, so that it would allow everyone to have access to more power, right? So that's an example of lifting the infrastructure, taking responsibility for the infrastructure of the ecosystem so that it can do more. And so, in terms of societal purpose or in terms of a collective purpose, they were going from selling processors to really taking responsibility to architect the entire industry. And the third element of an ecosystem is what we call communal functions. What are communal functions? It's all of these things, you know, in a village, you have all of these things that the public office typically takes care of, right? So the schools, making sure that, you know, the village is clean, and so on and so forth. And so in an ecosystem, you need to have those communal functions in exactly the same way. And as an ecosystem leader, or if you are involved in building an ecosystem, you need to ensure that this happens. And one key thing in an ecosystem is that you cannot just look after yourself. You have to help other stakeholders join your ecosystem and be successful and thrive in that ecosystem. So to give you an example, still with Intel, so Intel redid the architecture of the motherboard, but then people, you know, had more power, but they also didn't really completely know what to do with that power. So another activity that Intel did was to inspire people about how to use computers in a different way. All of the industry, all of the ecosystem of the PC industry. So they showed how, you know, a connected kitchen could look like. They showed what telecommunication or video conferencing could look like in the future. This is in the 90s, right? So to inspire new development of applications. So inspiring is a communal function. You're taking responsibility to help people see a new possibility. We've seen, I've told you about the University for Micro-Entrepreneurs that Taobao did. So they realized all these micro-entrepreneurs, they saw an opportunity, don't really know how to do business. Let's educate them for free, right? So let's take responsibility to make them successful so that the entire ecosystem can benefit. So upskilling is another communal function. Financing is another communal function. Sometimes you need to take responsibility to help, to subsidize an actor so that they have the possibility to participate. So Amazon did that with publishers. Publishers were afraid of losing their margins in the normal printed books if they were to switch to digital books. So Amazon said, okay, we're going to give you publishers our part of the profit, and us, we will, you know, it's a bigger play for us. So we don't need to have profitability out of this particular thing, but we'll figure out other synergies to make it worthwhile. The last one is enabling other actors of the ecosystem. So for example, Tesla gave their patents away for free to the rest of the industry so that the rest of the industry would get into this game of electric cars as well. Now, I've talked about a mayor as if it's just one person, right? Still Jack Ma or Elon Musk. But more and more, this mayor is becoming a distributed function, a collective function. And often, depending on where you are, you have to make a decision. Are you going to go alone? Are you going to be the mayor that controls everything? So for example, you're Elon Musk and Tesla and you're building a proprietary infrastructure with the charging stations. Or you're completely on the other spectrums. You're not legitimate to build infrastructure, to rally the ecosystem. And you have to influence, you have to use your power to influence and to make sure that things get done that you don't own yourself. So that's the story of some players in the auto industry in the early 20th century who, you know, had this new, they were sitting on this new technology that is an automobile, but then they thought, okay, we need roads so people actually enjoy this technology. And they didn't obviously build the roads themselves, they didn't own the roads, but they lobbied and they financed and they rallied people so that roads would get built. And sometimes it's in between. So this is an example of Roche in Canada. Roche is a pharma company for their personalized healthcare purpose, needs to have access to patient data, but nobody, especially in Canada, you know, very kind of multi-stakeholder society, would allow a pharma company to own patient data, right? So what they've done is create an organization, a not-for-profit organization, where they sit on the board of it, along with other pharma companies, research organizations, academia, and the government. And together, they define the rules by which they gather patient data and the rules by which all of these different actors can use them for their own purpose. So sometimes it's co-created, sometimes it's in between. So you have this other kind of lens now, a new lens that gives a different kind of perspective, a larger perspective that enables new possibilities. But now back to what many people have said, this Olga with systems thinking, Josie, Michael, a number of people have talked to us about the fact that when we deal with complexity, we can't have a linear mindset, right? And as soon as a human being trained in the kind of schools where we've been trained, we start kind of looking at this thing and we say, okay, it's easy, it's like a puzzle. We put the pieces together and we kind of optimize it. We kind of think a bit like with an engineer mindset. Now, for these kind of things, it doesn't really work, right? So the great ones, the great ecosystems, they think a bit differently. And I'll give you a shortcut. And for that shortcut, we have to turn to not so much business, but the world of the arts. Do you know this guy, Stefan Sagmeister? I was at a conference once where he did a test. So I want to do the same test with you today. I'm going to show you two pictures of Mondrians, the painter Mondrians, right? Two paintings. One is the original, the other is a fake one. You have to tell me which one is the original, all right? It's not a trick question. You just have to guess which one is the original. You ready? All right, so who says this one next to me is the original? All right, 2/3 maybe. Who says this one? Okay, third. So it is this one. And when he runs this test, about 85–90% guess the original. And what he says to us is that we as human beings have a way of recognizing beauty. Not beauty in terms of the preferences of your colors and things like that. It's more beauty that equals a sense of wholeness. It makes us feel good. It makes us feel like things are right, feel like things are ordered, they've been done in the right way. And so Mondrian, when, looking at his own process, he wasn't just trying to arrange boxes and lines and colors in a particular way. He was trying to get to something that is beautiful, trying to get the proportions right so that it would end up into something beautiful. So if you think about that, the organizing principles, the same thing as an ecosystem. You have parts, or in a business model, you have parts you need to arrange in a particular way. The organizing principle here is beauty, right? It's the idea of beauty, trying to do something beautiful. Same thing with architecture. Maybe some of you know Christopher Alexander, just passed away, I think, a couple of years ago. He's an advisor to Prince, now King Charles. He was one of the people that influenced the agile process in software development. But first and foremost, an architect. And this is what he says to us. He says that in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, people had a sense that God was everywhere, including in the buildings that they built, right? And so when they built buildings, they had a sense of respect and care and awe. And he says that's why when we look at these buildings, they uplift us. We get a sense of inspiration and a sense of awe when we look at these buildings because they're made with this kind of quality, right? And so the organizing principle here could be God, right? So we had beauty and art, God here. And one last one, this is also, I've used cities as a metaphor for ecosystems. So the same thing goes on for cities. Have you ever thought of what a city is organized around? And I think one interesting way of thinking about this is what is at the center of a city. It used to be the oracle in ancient Greece. It became maybe the church, government building, maybe nowadays more like a mall, right? What is the core value that we hold above everything else around which we're organizing a city? So this whole thing was going on in New York. I don't know if you've heard about Jane Jacobs, urbanist of the 20th century. But she was at war with this guy, Robert Moses. So Robert Moses was kind of an unofficial mayor in New York City in the 50s and 60s. He was a real estate mogul. He held or controlled all of the important offices of the city in terms of development works, etc. And he had a particular vision for what the city should look like, one focused on efficiency. Now, Jane Jacobs here became an urbanist, but she was first and foremost an inhabitant in the East Village. And her sense of the city was more that, no, actually it's about the life in the street. It's about having sidewalks that are large enough so that parents can walk easily with their strollers, for example, right? It's about mom and pop stores that are, that you can go to and have relationships with people. So these were two different visions of the city. Robert's vision was to build a 14-lane highway that would have gone from north to south of Manhattan. And consider this: would you have loved city? Would New York City have been such an admired city if you had a 14-lane highway that would have gone straight smack the middle of the city, right? So two different visions, two different organizing principles in terms of figuring out how to build this ensemble that is the city in this case. So now how do we relate this back to the ecosystem? Well, you had beauty, God, maybe vibrant life as organizing principles that organize these parts into a whole. I think it's the same thing with ecosystems, but with ecosystems, I think the key is to unlock meaning for people, to get a sense of what is needed, what is in the air, so to speak, of the particular theme that you want to have an impact about, and then to unlock that for people, right? And to lift it up to its best possible expression. Because if you don't do that, it's going to find expression in a lower form, right? That's why we have tech, addiction-inducing business models. I think that's why we have the kind of media that we have today. That's why we have buildings that are maybe not as beautiful as others are, that were built in the Alexander Way, etc. So unlocking meaning. And I want to go back and finish here with the story that I started with, Taobao. So Taobao, I told you, was all about job creation at the very beginning of their journey. And really what they did in terms of meaning is that they realized that it was all about lifting people out of poverty, giving them independence, allowing them to stay in their village and open an online shop, maybe even channeling their entrepreneurship and their creativity, right? So they felt that, and they built their whole ecosystem around it. And here's the kind of impact they had. 16 million jobs created in the first 8 years that I've shown you at the very beginning, this journey. There is a whole kind of new idea of what commerce is in China, with a lot more integrity. You have anecdotes of people all of a sudden changing their language, saying dear seller, dear buyer, whereas before they wouldn't trust each other. By the way, Jack Ma says one of the secrets of Taobao is that they have 50% men and 50% women in the organization. And he says, there's a lot about kind of building this, hard stuff infrastructure, but also about caring for the kind of quality that happens in these places. They brought rural China onto e-commerce with 8 million jobs created, their income flourished, and so on and so forth. And really, they weren't really just about building a company, right? They were really about lifting this whole game of commerce. So Jack Ma says they weren't an e-commerce company, so to speak, themselves. They were there to build a new structure so that e-commerce companies could flourish, could be born and could flourish. And so they really unleashed a whole new way of creating value in the country. And if you compare this story with the story of e-commerce in the West, right? So in the West, you have kind of, before e-commerce started, you had an economy that was pretty much functioning. Now e-commerce arrives and you get cheaper prices, you get more convenience, you get more speed. It's essentially a story of efficiency. In the East, with the story of Taobao, it's a lot more about empowerment, empowering all of these people to take ownership of their own life, creating their livelihoods, entrepreneurship, and creativity. So in the West, we've become enamored with this idea of disruption. The disruption is kind of interesting for the person who disrupts the status quo, right? And it's okay, it creates a lot of value. At the same time, it's not so funny if you're the guy who's disrupted, and from a societal standpoint, it's not really clear if it really adds value in the long term, right? This whole notion of disruption. So what I see in the East with the story of Taobao, but with all of these ecosystems that are doing it right, they're doing something that's more like upruption. What do I mean by upruption? Well, if disruption kind of moves value from one set of actor to another, they kind of move value laterally, upruption is all about lifting this whole game around the theme that you're working on, to a higher plane, right? So you're creating a superior equilibrium with where most people, if not all, are better off as a process, and you've kind of upgrading how a theme gets addressed in society. So you can think about, so upruption, you've heard Taobao, the context was 2003 in China. You can think about what upruption might look like in your sector and for some of the issues, global issues, that in societal and business and economic issues that we have nowadays. So as a summary, 3 shifts I think that are kind of happening right now, or that are needed for us to embrace this idea of ecosystems and upruption. One is to go from the business model to the ecosystem, playing a bigger game. The second is to embrace a different leadership style, not just being a CEO looking after a business, but a mayor looking after the collective, and then going from disruption to upruption, the kind of innovation that lifts everybody up. Thank you so much.